Wyoming Territory, summer of 1873, the wind had teeth that morning. The sun rose over the high plains outside of Casper, brushing the dry grass in gold. Hawks circled above the ridgeline, and a wagon wheel creaked as it turned slowly down the empty trail. The woman driving it had blood on the hem of her dress and a baby balanced on each hip, their faces tucked against her collarbone. She had not slept in 2 days. Her name was Florence Dunn, and she had been banished, not for stealing, not for lying or adultery, but for giving birth to twin girls. The town preacher called them a curse, born under a red moon. Her husband Thomas had died before the birth kicked in the chest by a mule during a storm, and Florence had no man to defend her, so they cast her out. No food, no coin, just a broken wagon and 2 infants in her arms. By the time she stumbled off the trail near a watering hole, her throat was raw from thirst and her arms shook from holding her daughters. She dropped to her knees beside the shallow creek and leaned over the bank, careful not to jostle the girls. One stirred, whimpering softly. "SHH Delia," Florence whispered. "Just a little longer, baby." The other twin, Daisy, let out a soft cry and kicked her legs. Florence pressed her cheek to their fine hair, whispering nonsense to hush them. Her lips were dry, her heart beat too fast. She was not sure if she was going to faint or die. A shadow moved behind her without sound. A man on horseback watched from the ridge. He had been following the broken tracks for nearly an hour, curious who had left them. Whoever it was, they were not headed anywhere with sense. He dismounted and approached slowly, boots crunching over dry dirt. "You all right, madam?" His voice was low, steady. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder and a wide-brimmed hat shading his face. Florence turned fast, clutching her daughters tighter. Her eyes were wild, untrusting. "Stay back." She rasped. He raised both hands. "I am not here to hurt you. Name's Hayes Northwood. I saw your wagon tracks, thought someone might be lost." She looked him over dusty coat, a clean-shaven face, no badge, no preacher's collar. His eyes were light brown and kind. He looked like a man who had worked hard and never raised his voice unless he needed to. "We do not want help," she said, even though her hands trembled from weakness. "You sure? You look like you have not had water in a while, and those little ones." He nodded toward the girls. "They cannot go much longer like this." Florence did not answer. She was too tired to argue. Hayes stepped forward, slow as a man gentling a spooked horse. He took a canteen from his saddle and knelt beside her, offering it without touching her. She took it, drank, then tipped a few drops onto a handkerchief and dabbed her daughter's lips. Hayes watched her closely. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere they will not stone us in the street," she said bitterly. He blinked. "Stone you? They say we are cursed because I had twins, because my man died." "Because I have no one." Hayes's jaw tightened. "That is not a curse, that is just plain life, and it is cruel enough without people adding to it." Florence looked away. She hated how the kindness in his voice made her throat ache. "Do you have people nearby?" she asked, her tone quieter. Hayes tilted his head. "I have a ranch 5 miles east. It is just me and an old dog, a few cattle, not much, but it is dry and there is food." "You want something from me?" He met her eyes. "No, madam, I just do not like seeing a woman and 2 babies left to die in the dirt." Florence looked down at her daughters. They were quiet now, too quiet. She swallowed hard. "You will not try anything?" "No, madam," he said again. "You have my word." She nodded once. Hayes helped her onto his horse, careful not to touch her more than needed. He lifted the girls into her arms after she settled in the saddle. Then he walked beside them, leading the horse step by step toward the rising sun. At the ranch, Florence could barely stand when she dismounted. Hayes caught her elbow, steadying her. "You are safe now. Let me get you inside." The cabin was small but solid, with a porch and a well out front. Hayes opened the door and cleared a space on the cot near the wood stove. Florence lay down, the babies curled against her. Her whole body sagged into the mattress. "You can rest," he said gently. "You are not alone anymore." She wanted to cry, but she was too tired. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you," and closed her eyes. The next morning, Florence woke to the smell of coffee and cornbread. Light spilled through the window, warming the floorboards. Delia and Daisy were asleep in a wooden crate Hayes had padded with wool blankets. Hayes sat at the table, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a rocking horse. His hat was on the peg, his sleeves rolled up. He looked up when he saw her stir. "Morning, you slept hard." She sat up slowly. "I cannot stay long. You can stay as long as you need." "I do not want your charity," he stood. "It is not charity. I am not doing this out of pity." "Then why?" Hayes walked over and crouched so they were eye level. "Because I think you are strong as hell, and those girls deserve a chance." "That is all." Florence stared at him. Her chest hurt in a way that was not pain. She had not heard words like that since Thomas died. She looked toward her daughters. Delia stirred in her sleep, her little hand curling around Daisy's. "They are all I have," she whispered. "You are not alone anymore," Hayes said. Florence blinked fast and looked away. She did not know what to say. Days passed. Then a week. Then, too, Florence began helping in the garden, sewing new clothes for the girls, mending Hayes's shirts. He built a wooden crib for the twins and carved their names into the footboard, Delia and Daisy. She baked bread. He taught her to shoot. They talked over quiet dinners, their words easy. Hayes never pushed. Florence never ran one night. Florence stood on the porch watching the stars. Hayes came up beside her, silent. "You never asked what I did before the twins," she said. "I figured you would tell me when you were ready." She looked at him, her face lit by moonlight. "I was a teacher. I used to believe life made sense in a book. That if you followed the rules, good things came. And now I believe in the man who gave 3 strangers a home with nothing asked in return." Hayes looked at her for a long time. Then he reached out and gently touched her hand. "Florence," he said, voice soft. "I do not want you to leave," she swallowed. "I do not want to leave either." He stepped closer. She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers trembling. "I am scared," she whispered. "So am I," he said. Then he kissed her and the world went still. Florence kissed him back. And for the first time in a long, long time, she felt like home. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows over the cottonwoods along the creek. Florence sat cross-legged in the shade behind the cabin. A length of muslin stretched across her lap, her needle gliding through it in slow, practiced movements. Delia and Daisy lay in a woven cradle basket beside her, their arms twitching in sleep, cheeks pink from the heat. A breeze stirred the tall grass, and the muffled sound of a saw rasped from the barn. Hayes had taken to checking the fence lines each morning, then turning his attention to a new lean-to he was building behind the barn. She hadn't asked what for he worked without complaint and came in smelling of cedar and sweat, his hands nicked from the blade. He'd taken to fetching eggs from the henhouse without her asking, and she'd noticed how his gait softened when he passed the cradle. She finished the final stitch, tied off the thread with a tug of her teeth, and folded the small garment over her lap. A dress for Delia she'd make Daisy's tomorrow. She set it aside and looked toward the barn. "You've been at it for hours," she said once she reached the doorway. Hayes straightened, brushing sawdust from his trousers. "Just wanted it done before the rains come." "What's it meant for?" she asked, stepping inside. He turned toward the half-finished structure, a simple open shed, roof already framed. "Thought the girls might need a spot to sit in the shade soon once they start crawling. I'll hang blankets down the sides when it's hot." She stared at it, blinking once. "You built that for them?" "Of course I did." A silence passed between them, filled only by the whisper of wind through the barn slats. Then Florence stepped closer, folding her arms. "You always do that," she said. "Do what? Act like it's nothing. Like it costs you nothing to share what you have." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed now too. "I don't think it costs anything to care. Not everyone agrees. I'm not everyone." She looked away, jaw tight, then back at him. "When you say things like that, I don't know how to answer. You don't have to." Another silence. She rubbed her thumb along the seam of her skirt, then let out a breath. "Thomas wasn't cruel," she said, "but he never asked what I needed. He just expected I'd manage." Hayes didn't move, didn't interrupt. "I always did," she went on. "But sometimes I wanted someone to notice when I couldn't." Hayes stepped forward, slow enough not to make her flinch. He stopped with a respectful distance, he said. She met his eyes, then looked away again, voice quieter. I know you do. From outside, one of the twins stirred, letting out a soft wail. Florence turned toward the sound instinctively, but Hayes touched her arm just briefly. I'll get her. She hesitated, then nodded. He stepped outside, and she followed him onto the porch as he crouched beside the cradle basket. He picked up Delia with both hands, careful and sure, cradling her against his chest. Florence watched the way his hand supported her neck, the way his voice dropped low as he murmured something to soothe her. Delia hiccuped once, then settled. She trusts you, Florence said. She's got a smart head on her shoulders, he replied. She smiled, but it faded quickly. I'll need work, she said. Some kind of way to earn. You don't owe me anything? I don't want to owe you, Hayes nodded. All right, there's a widow east of here, Mrs. Tallow. Her eyesight's gone poor, but she keeps bees. She's been looking for someone to help bottle and stitch labels. Florence blinked. Bees? You'd be paid in honey, mostly, but she trades it well. Might be a start. Florence glanced toward the horizon, where the land rolled gently into the distance. The thought of walking into another home didn't sit easy in her chest, but Hayes wasn't pushing. I'll go tomorrow, she said. I'll ride with you. She looked at him then, really looked. His beard had grown in a bit. He had a bruise on his left forearm, faint and yellowing. She hadn't noticed it before. He shifted the baby in his arms and rocked her gently. You always like this? She asked. He tilted his head. Like what? Steady. His mouth turned up just slightly. Not always. But I try. A gust of wind stirred the dust along the trail. Florence sat on the porch step and reached into the cradle to lift Daisy. The baby's eyes opened, unfocused and dark, and she gave a tiny sneeze. Hayes sat beside her, still holding Delia. I think there'll be walkers before long, he said. She nodded. That's when the real work begins. We'll manage, she turned toward him. His eyes met hers. I'd like that, he said. She didn't answer right away, but the silence between them was different now. It wasn't the absence of words, it was the presence of something growing. Daisy gurgled in her arms. Florence looked down at her daughter, then back at Hayes. I'd like that too, she said. And just like that, the air shifted, not loud, not sudden, but certain, the bell above Mrs. Tallow's porch door rang faintly as Florence stepped through, holding Daisy tight against her hip, while Hayes followed behind with Delia. The scent of beeswax and dried lavender clung to the air, and the windows were covered with thin muslin to keep the sun from bleaching the shelves of glass jars that lined the walls. Mrs. Tallow sat near the hearth, her gray braid wound like rope around her head, a shawl draped over her shoulders despite the warmth. Her milky eyes turned toward the sound of their boots. Come in then, she said. I can tell by the steps you're not here to buy honey. Florence stepped forward, her voice clear. Hayes said you might need hands. Mrs. Tallow nodded once. Heard his voice soon as the latch lifted, knew it wasn't just the wind this time. Florence smiled faintly. I can sew, and I'm light-fingered with glass. I won't drop a jar. Good. I can still feel the difference between a tight lid and a lazy one. Sit the baby down if she'll let you. There's a crate by the window. Hayes crouched and settled Delia in the lined box, and Florence mirrored him with Daisy. Both girls blinked at the filtered light but didn't fuss. Mrs. Tallow reached for a bundle of cloth beside her and held it out. Labels are cut already. Stitch them onto lengths of ribbon. I loop the ribbon round the jar necks, less waste than paper. Florence sat at the corner table, fingers moving without hesitation. Hayes lingered by the door, eyes sweeping the room. You're always watching things, Mrs. Tallow said, her tone dry. I like to know what's around me. You're one of those quiet men who keeps a rifle under the bed and bread warm in the oven. Florence glanced up, amused. That's not too far off. I like him, the old woman said. He doesn't talk unless he means it. Hayes looked at Florence, then back to Mrs. Tallow. She's the one you ought to be watching. She's the brave one. Mrs. Tallow didn't respond right away. Then she said, bravery's just fear with knees that don't buckle. She'll do. They stayed until the sun tipped west. Florence stitched until her hands ached, stopping only to nurse the girls once. Hayes helped Mrs. Tallow stack filled baskets in the larder, and when it came time to leave, she pressed a small jar into Florence's palm. "Rose honey," she said. "For your tea or your scars, whichever needs it more." Florence looked down at it, throat tightening. "Thank you." Outside, the sky ran soft with copper and blue. Hayes lifted Daisy into the sling across his chest, tying it with practiced ease. Florence carried Delia, her head resting against her collar. "I didn't realize how much I missed working with my hands," she said as they walked. "Doing something that stays done. You looked steady in there." I felt steady. A silence passed, thick with meaning. "When I came west," Hayes said, "I thought I was looking for space. Turns out I was just waiting for the right reason to stay still." Florence glanced at him, a question in her eyes. He kept walking. "I never thought I'd want to share my land or my table. But I do now." She stopped mid-path, boots sinking into the soft dirt. "Hayes," he turned, Daisy asleep against his chest, his face open and unguarded. "I'm not asking for promises," he said, "just truth." Florence stepped toward him. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like. But I know I want to face it with someone who builds cradles without being asked." He didn't speak, but his hand reached for hers as though it had always belonged there. She let him take it. The walk back to the cabin was quiet, not for lack of things to say, but because no words were needed. That night, after the girls were asleep, Florence stood at the wooden table, drying dishes while Hayes fed a fresh log to the stove. "I've been thinking," she said. He looked up. "I want to plant a row of beans along the fence. Could teach the girls to tend them when they're older." He leaned against the counter, drying his hands on a cloth. "I'll dig the rows tomorrow, and maybe we could build a second bed." His brow lifted slightly. "For company, for family." Hayes crossed the space between them, slow but sure. He touched her face with the back of his hand, then laid his palm against her cheek. "I never thought I'd say it, but you and those girls, you made this place feel alive again." Florence leaned into him. "Then let's keep it alive, together." They didn't kiss, not that night. Instead, they stood there in the quiet, the stove casting amber light against the walls, their hands joined between them. And in that stillness, something deep and lasting settled between them, like roots pressing into earth. The first frost came early that year. Hayes found it clinging like lace to the garden beds before dawn. The beans Florence had planted now bowed beneath a thin sheen of white. He touched the curled leaves with 2 fingers, then stood and pulled his coat tighter. The girls were still inside, curled against their mother in the warmth of the cabin. He'd split wood the night before, enough to keep the stove going until midday. Inside, the cabin was quiet save for the low pop of kindling catching flame. Florence lay on her side, hair loose over the quilt, one arm curled around Delia, the other stretched toward Daisy. Both girls stirred in the half-light, their cheeks still full with sleep. Hayes shut the door gently behind him. "I didn't think it would come so soon," she said without lifting her head. "It'll pass quick, just a warning." Florence sat up and gathered the girls into her lap. "We'll need to bring the herbs in. The rosemary's too tender for this kind of cold. I'll help after breakfast." He poured hot water from the kettle into a tin basin and set it on the table. She dipped a cloth into it and cleaned the girls' faces, then her own, her movements running smooth from habit. "I had a letter once," she said, not looking up, "from my mother's sister in Ohio, years ago, asked me to come east after Thomas died, said it'd be easier among womenfolk. You never went." I couldn't stomach the thought of being pitied. Hayes leaned against the doorframe. "She's still right," Florence shook her head. "Not since I didn't answer." He didn't press further. The past had a way of quieting when you let it settle. By midday, they'd harvested what they could. Bundles of thyme, sage, and lavender hung from the rafters, scenting the air. Florence worked with her sleeves rolled, her hands dusted with earth. Hayes caught her humming once a low, almost soundless tune and said nothing, but the sound stayed with him the rest of the afternoon. Later, while the girls napped, Florence sat at the table with a stack of linens beside her, patching worn spots with even stitches. "There's a gathering next week," Hayes said gently. "Harvest meal, folks bring what they can." Florence didn't look up. "You go to things like that, sometimes." "Why?" "To remind myself there's still neighbors." She set her needle on the table and looked at him. "You think we should go?" "I think you should decide for yourself." She glanced toward the cradle where the girls slept, then out the window where the sky had turned the color of pewter wool. "I don't want to be stared at," she said. "You won't be alone." She nodded once, slow and thoughtful. "I'll think on it." That evening, Hayes brought in a crate and set it near the hearth. Inside were strips of soft leather, some dyed, some plain. "My ma taught me to work with hide when I was a boy," he said. "Figured the girls'll need shoes come spring." Florence ran her fingers over the material. "You kept all this?" "I keep what might be useful. I never learned leather work. I'll show you." She smiled, then not wide, not bright, but real, and picked up one of the softer pieces. The next few days passed with the rhythm of early cold. Hayes repaired a stall in the barn. Florence taught herself how to bind the herb bundles tighter to prevent mildew. She'd taken to writing down rows of letters in a small notebook she'd found among Hayes's things, teaching the girls their names one syllable at a time. The morning before the Bixby gathering, Florence stood in front of the small mirror Hayes had hung near the wash basin. She wore a dress she hadn't touched since Thomas's burial. The fabric still held the faint scent of cedar where she'd stored it in a chest beneath the bed. Hayes stepped behind her, his reflection catching beside hers in the glass. "You look steady," he said. "I feel like a thread pulled too tight." He reached up and smoothed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering just long enough. "If you want to leave halfway through, we will. No questions." Florence nodded, and the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly. The wagon ride was quiet. The girls sat between them, wrapped in thick shawls, their heads bobbing with each turn of the wheels. The Bixby homestead came into view just as the sun broke through the cloud cover, casting gold along the tops of the cottonwoods. Dozens of buggies and wagons lined the field nearby. Florence's hands tightened on her lap. Hayes glanced over. "You're not them." She looked at him. "You're better," he said. She exhaled and gave a single nod. Inside the barn where the gathering took place, long tables were arranged end to end. Platters of roasted squash, loaves of bread, and pies lined the boards. A fiddle played somewhere near the back, slow and warming. Florence didn't let go of Hayes's arm at first, but when Mrs. Tallow appeared beside her, a tin cup of cider in her hand, and said, "I knew you'd come with your chin high." Something shifted in Florence's face. She released Hayes's arm and took the cup. "Don't think I don't see how he watches you," Mrs. Tallow added, nodding toward Hayes. "That's not the look of a man doing a kindness. That's the look of a man who's found a place to root." Florence looked toward him, across the room, where he was bouncing Daisy in one arm, laughing quietly with a neighbor boy who'd made a face at her. That ache returned, not the kind that came from loss, but the kind that made space for something else. When she stepped forward and took Delia from the cradle Hayes had set beside the table, he looked at her with a question in his eyes. She leaned in close. "I want to stay the whole evening." He smiled, not wide, not showy, but like a door had opened inside him. They ate together. They listened to the music. When the sun dipped low and the girls began to fuss, Hayes wrapped them both in blankets and carried them to the wagon. Florence walked beside him, her hand brushing his as they went. When they reached the porch that night, stars scattered above like spilled oats, she turned to him before he could open the door. "I'm not afraid of being seen anymore." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met." She stepped forward, hands on his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her palms. "I think I love you," she said. He didn't answer with words. Just took her face in his hands and kissed her with the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly what he wanted. And for once, she didn't feel like she had to earn it. She already had. The first snow came in the night, soft as flour sifted onto the roof. By morning, the world was hushed. No bird song. No rustle of wind through grass, just the slow drip of melting flakes from the eaves and the muffled crunch of boots as Hayes crossed the yard to check the barn roof. Inside, Florence stood near the window with Delia on her hip and Daisy tugging at her skirt. She pressed a hand to the glass, watching Hayes test the eaves with a long-handled broom. He moved methodically, brushing snow from the low slope, his coat already dusted white. "We'll need to bring in more firewood," she said aloud, mostly to herself. Daisy let go of her skirt and toddled toward the hearth, where the morning coals still glowed red in content. Florence followed and knelt, easing Delia down beside her sister. The girls had grown sturdier this past month, with strong legs and sharp eyes that missed nothing. They babbled to each other now, in soft whistles and half-formed words, and Florence had begun to read to them aloud, though they mostly watched her lips move. When Hayes stepped back inside, shaking snow from his shoulders, he found Florence already tying her shawl. "I'll help you with the wood," she said. "They'll be fine for a few minutes." Hayes nodded and held the door for her, the cold bit at her cheeks as they crossed to the woodpile. She liked this part of the day, the steady work, the feel of her breath in the air, the way Hayes handed her each split log without needing to speak. "You ever think about building on?" she asked, brushing snow from her sleeves. He set another log in the crook of her arm. "You mean a second room?" "I mean a real kitchen, and maybe a loft for the girls when they're older." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I've thought on it some. Wouldn't take much, just good lumber and time." Florence smiled. "We've got both." They stacked the wood high beside the door and went back inside. The girls had curled into each other near the stove, warm and content. Florence knelt to lift them, pressing a kiss to each downy head. "I've got something for you," Hayes said, his voice softer. She turned to see him holding a slim box wrapped in cotton muslin. He looked almost sheepish. "What's this?" she asked. "Something I carved. Took most evenings after you went to bed." She untied the muslin and opened the box. Inside lay a set of small wooden animals, 2 horses, a calf, and a bear no bigger than her thumb, each carved in fine detail and smoothed to a satiny finish. She reached for one of the horses and turned it over in her palm. "They're beautiful," she said. "You did all this," he nodded. "Thought the girls might like them. Thought you might too." "I do." She looked up at him, eyes bright. "You've given us more than I ever thought I'd have again." "I didn't give you anything you didn't already make your own." She stepped close, her hand still curled around the little horse. "You could have chosen an easier life." "I didn't want easier, I wanted you." Her breath caught. "You have me." The girls stirred, crawling toward the box with soft sounds of delight. Florence knelt and handed them each an animal, then sat back against Hayes's chest as they played. His arms came around her without hesitation, and she leaned into the warmth of him, her face tucked beneath his chin. That night they sat together after the girls had gone to sleep, a pot of stew simmering on the back of the stove. Hayes pulled a folded paper from his coat and set it on the table. "I've been keeping this," he said. "Didn't want to show you until you were ready." She unfolded the paper. Inside was a land deed, 60 acres filed in both their names, the ink dark and precise. "I had it changed at the courthouse last time I took cattle to market," he said. "I figured this place ought to be yours as much as mine." Florence stared at the paper. "You didn't have to." "I know, I wanted to." She folded the deed carefully and set it aside. Then she stood and turned to him, her voice steady. "We should marry." He rose, watching her. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure. Not because I need a name or because people will talk, but because I want to wake beside you knowing there's no more waiting between us." Hayes stepped forward, his hands settling at her waist. "You'll have my name. And everything else I've got." They kissed there in the still warmth of the cabin, with the snow falling outside and the fire burning low. A week later they stood in front of the county clerk with the girls bundled close. No fanfare, no audience. Just a signature and a promise, made in the quiet way they did most things. That spring, Hayes built the loft himself. Florence planted onions and carrots along the fence line. The The girls helped or tried to dragging sticks through the dirt and chasing chickens with squeals of delight. The kitchen doubled in size by midsummer, and Florence painted the shutters blue on clear evenings. They sat on the porch with the girls asleep above, their fingers laced together and their knees touching. Hayes would say, "This is what I hoped for," and Florence would answer, "It's more than I ever dreamed." They never left the land. There was no need. Everything they had ever needed had grown from the soil beneath their feet and the quiet, enduring love between them. Nothing grand, nothing loud. Just a life made whole together.